In 2010, a man named A.J. Jacobs conducted an unusual experiment on himself. He decided to spend an entire year living according to every rule, instruction, and command found in the Bible. Not symbolically, not selectively, literally. He changed the clothes he wore, the way he ate, how he greeted people, what he touched, what he avoided, how he organized his days, and even how he interacted with strangers. His habits did not change because some inner revelation suddenly transformed him. They changed because he rebuilt the architecture surrounding his life. At first, the experiment looked absurd. A modern man trying to obey ancient prescriptions in contemporary New York sounded almost comedic. But something unsettling emerged from the process. As the external rules multiplied, his behavior began shifting in ways he had not consciously planned. His impulses softened. His routines became more rigid. His awareness sharpened. Small environmental constraints started producing internal psychological effects. This is what most people misunderstand about personal change. They imagine transformation begins inside, as if a person first becomes different in thought and only later behaves differently. But reality is often less romantic and far less flattering. In many cases, behavior changes first because conditions change first. A different schedule alters attention. A different room changes what your hands reach for. A different social expectation edits what you say before you even realize it. The environment does not politely ask who you want to become. Quietly votes on your identity all day long. And most of the time, it votes for the version of you that already exists. People love the mythology of reinvention. They admire the story of the person who wakes up one day, feels a surge of motivation, and becomes someone new through pure force of will. It is an appealing fantasy because it protects the ego. If change is only a matter of deciding hard enough, then failure can be blamed on weak desire. But daily life tells a more brutal story. A person decides to become disciplined, yet their room still contains every object linked to distraction. They decide to get healthier, yet their kitchen remains engineered around convenience and impulse. They want emotional stability, but continue spending hours with people who reinforce insecurity, drama, and familiar self-doubt. Then comes the predictable collapse. They assume they lacked discipline. They accuse themselves of inconsistency. They promise to try harder next Monday, next month, next year. But the system around them remains untouched, and so the outcome repeats with mechanical precision. This is not a coincidence. It is structural. Human behavior is often less a reflection of values than a negotiation with immediate surroundings. What is visible gets chosen. What is convenient gets repeated. What is normalized stops feeling strange. Over time, repetition hardens into identity, and identity begins masquerading as personality. You start saying things like, "This is just who I am," not because you discovered your true nature, but because your environment trained a version of you so many times that it started feeling inevitable. The frightening part is not that environments influence behavior. That much is obvious. The frightening part is how little awareness most people have of the invisible systems scripting their days. There is a reason certain places make you feel heavy the moment you enter them. A room can contain memory. A neighborhood can preserve an older version of you like a fossil trapped in stone. A social group can keep resurrecting habits you thought you buried years ago. Nothing mystical is happening. No invisible curse is haunting your progress. It is simpler and more dangerous than that. Your nervous system is constantly reading cues. Faces, sounds, smells, lighting, objects, timing, language patterns, rituals, expectations. Every repeated element acts like a signal telling your brain what mode to enter. Who are you here? Are you the focused version? The anxious version? The compliant version? The avoidant version? The smaller version people are comfortable with? Most individuals believe they are making independent decisions while unconsciously adapting to scripts embedded in familiar surroundings. And that means a disturbing possibility emerges. You may not be struggling to become someone new because you are incapable. You may be struggling because every layer of your life is organized to preserve continuity. What you are about to uncover is not motivational advice. It is a confrontation with the hidden mechanics shaping behavior long before conscious choice feels involved. Once seen clearly, ordinary things stop looking ordinary. A doorway, a desk, a conversation, a notification, a routine morning. Each one begins to reveal itself as part of a larger operating system deciding who gets reinforced and who slowly disappears. The mind likes to believe it is sovereign. It likes the comforting illusion that thoughts create actions, actions create results, and results create identity. A clean, rational sequence with the individual heroically in control. But what if that order is backwards? What if identity is not primarily the result of personal decisions, but the residue of repeated exposure? What if the version of you that feels most natural is not the truest version, but simply the most rehearsed? This would explain why people can passionately desire change while unconsciously defending the exact systems preventing it. They say they want freedom, yet preserve familiar chaos. They say they want growth, yet remain emotionally loyal to environments that reward stagnation. They say they are ready for a new life, while protecting the architecture of the old one with astonishing devotion. And this creates the paradox almost nobody wants to face. If your daily environment is continuously manufacturing the current version of you, then who exactly is making your choices? Is it really you deciding? Or are you merely performing the most statistically probable behavior inside a system designed by repetition, comfort, memory, and social expectation? Because if your surroundings have been quietly building you for years, then one uncomfortable possibility becomes impossible to ignore. Maybe your biggest obstacle has never been a lack of discipline. Maybe you have been living inside a machine that keeps rebuilding the person you are trying to leave behind. In a laboratory in St. Petersburg during the 1890s, Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov was not trying to understand habits, identity, or self-sabotage. His original interest was digestion. He wanted to study salivation in dogs as a biological response to food. Clean, mechanical, predictable. At first, everything behaved exactly as expected. Food was presented. Saliva followed. Cause and effect seemed obvious. But then something inconvenient began interfering with the experiment. The dogs started salivating before the food arrived. Not when eating. Not when tasting. Earlier. Sometimes it happened when they heard footsteps approaching the room. Sometimes when they noticed the assistant who regularly fed them. Sometimes at the sound of doors opening or subtle environmental cues associated with feeding. This was a problem scientifically, but a revelation psychologically. The body had begun reacting to signals that were never originally meaningful. A neutral stimulus, a sound, a person, a sequence of events, had become biologically powerful through repetition. Pattern had been installed. Pavlov realized he was no longer observing simple digestion. He was observing learning embedded directly into the nervous system. The implications were far larger than the laboratory. A bell means nothing by itself. A footstep means nothing by itself. A hallway, a voice, a chair, a notification sound, a time of day. None of these carry inherent command over human behavior. Until repetition assigns them meaning, then something strange happens. The cue no longer feels like a cue, feels like you. The body begins preparing before conscious intention enters awareness. Attention shifts, craving rises, emotion activates. The reaction starts running before thought can claim authorship. And this is where the illusion of personal control begins to crack. Pavlov formalized what he had accidentally discovered. Food was the unconditioned stimulus. Salivation was the unconditioned response. This was natural biology. But if a neutral signal was repeatedly paired with food, something changed. A bell, for example, initially meant nothing to the dog, produced no biological relevance. Then the bell was sounded before feeding, again, and again, and again. Over time, the nervous system linked the two events. Eventually, the bell alone triggered salivation. No food was necessary. Reality had been edited. The dog was no longer reacting to what was present. It was reacting to what had been learned. This is classical conditioning in its most unsettling form. The nervous system stops waiting for reality and starts predicting it. That prediction then generates a physical response as if the expected event were already happening. This is not a metaphor. It is physiology. A sound can begin a chemical cascade. A location can activate anticipation. A repeated sequence can trigger the body into emotional states without permission. Long before language explains what is happening, the organism is already responding. This should force a deeply uncomfortable question. How much of what you call preference is actually conditioning? How many of your daily reactions are not choices, but rehearsed responses attached to cues you no longer notice? A certain chair and suddenly distraction feels irresistible. A certain time at night and craving appears on schedule. A certain conversation and your body prepares for conflict before a single hostile word is spoken. What feels spontaneous is often structured. What feels personal is often patterned. And most patterns are installed quietly enough that the subject mistakes programming for personality. The true danger of conditioning is not that it creates responses. The true danger is that once the pattern is stable, the trigger becomes ordinary. It disappears into the background. No one panics when hearing a familiar notification sound. No one consciously analyzes why entering a specific room changes their mental state. No one stops to ask why certain people reliably produce insecurity, defensiveness, submission, or avoidance. The sequence simply runs. A cue appears. A state activates. A behavior follows. Then the conscious mind arrives late and writes a flattering explanation. This is why people often believe they are making rational decisions while merely completing conditioned loops. They feel an urge and call it desire. They feel tension and call it personality. They feel avoidance and call it preference. But the body may have started moving long before the narrative was invented. Pavlov's laboratory revealed something almost humiliating about biological systems. Repeated association can overpower awareness. Not because the organism is irrational, but because prediction is efficient. The nervous system is designed to reduce uncertainty, conserve energy, and automate what has proven statistically reliable. This is adaptive. It is also dangerous, because once an environment repeatedly pairs certain cues with certain reactions, your behavior begins outsourcing itself. You stop needing active decisions. The loop handles it. And eventually, what was once a learned response becomes so integrated that interruption feels unnatural. Breaking the pattern no longer feels like freedom, feels like friction, like discomfort, like something is wrong, which means many people are not addicted to outcomes. They are addicted to familiar sequences. This is where the discovery becomes personal. A person can sincerely want change and still feel pulled toward behaviors they consciously reject. Not because they are weak, not because they secretly enjoy sabotage, but because the body has learned to anticipate itself. The environment speaks first. A desk can trigger work or procrastination. A kitchen can trigger nourishment or compulsion. A voice can trigger calm or regression into an older emotional state you thought you had outgrown. And the more often the loop is repeated, the less visible it becomes. This creates one of the most deceptive experiences in human psychology. You believe you are encountering fresh choices, but in reality, you are often stepping into preloaded reactions prepared by repetition. The moment arrives, and the response is already halfway complete. This means your environment is not neutral scenery. It is active instruction. Every object, sound, timing pattern, and repeated association is quietly teaching your nervous system what to expect and how to behave. Most people never examine this machinery. They continue negotiating with urges whose origins they never question. They fight symptoms while leaving triggers untouched. And so the pattern survives. Because what began as an external cue eventually becomes internal momentum. But what almost nobody understands is that conditioning is only the beginning. Learning a response is one thing. Discovering what happens when the environment itself starts shaping identity, behavior, and morality on a much larger scale is something far more unsettling. In August 1971, a group of psychologically healthy college students answered a newspaper advertisement at Stanford University. The offer was simple: $15 a day to participate in a study about prison life. Nothing about the invitation suggested danger. The participants were screened beforehand. They were selected precisely because they were considered emotionally stable, physically healthy, and free from criminal or pathological tendencies. Ordinary young men. No known signs of sadism. No histories suggesting volatility or psychological instability. A basement in Stanford's psychology department was converted into a simulated prison. Cells were built. Uniforms were prepared. Numbers replaced names. One group was randomly assigned to be guards. The other became prisoners. Randomly. Not based on personality. Not based on ideology. Not because one group possessed darker tendencies. Just assignment. Then the environment was activated. The prisoners were arrested at their homes by actual Palo Alto police officers cooperating with the experiment. They were handcuffed, searched, booked, fingerprinted, and transported as though entering a real correctional system. This detail mattered. The transformation did not begin inside the basement. It began the moment external reality started validating the assigned role. By the time participants entered the mock prison, the psychological script was already underway. Clothing was removed. Uniforms were issued. Personal identity was systematically reduced. The prisoners wore smocks, stocking caps, and chains around their ankles. Guards wore military-style uniforms, mirrored sunglasses, whistles, and carried batons. A stage had been built, but something far more disturbing was about to happen. The costumes did not remain costumes for long, because once the environment consistently reinforces a role, behavior begins adjusting with astonishing speed. And the person inside the role starts becoming harder to locate. The shift happened faster than expected. Within hours, guards began asserting authority in increasingly aggressive ways. Orders became harsher. Language became more dehumanizing. Small exercises of control escalated into humiliation rituals. Prisoners were instructed to perform arbitrary tasks. They were awakened during the night for repeated roll calls. They were forced to clean toilets with bare hands. Push-ups became punishment. Compliance was demanded not for operational necessity, but for dominance. No one had explicitly instructed the guards to become cruel. That is what made the experiment so psychologically explosive. The role itself began generating behavior. The environment did not merely permit authoritarian conduct. It rewarded it. Power became available. Anonymity reduced accountability. Uniforms concealed individuality. And the social structure provided moral cover. Under these conditions, actions that might have felt absurd in ordinary life suddenly became normalized. The guards did not need to be monsters. They only needed a system that made domination feel functional. Meanwhile, prisoners began showing rapid signs of emotional deterioration. Stress responses intensified. Some became passive. Some became obedient. Some broke down. One participant, prisoner 8612, experienced acute emotional distress and was released early after visible psychological destabilization. This was supposed to be a 2-week study. It was terminated after only 6 days. Not because the simulation failed, because it worked too well. The environment had accelerated adaptation with terrifying efficiency. Ordinary individuals had not merely followed instructions. They had begun internalizing a world with new rules, new permissions, and new moral boundaries. And under the right architecture, those boundaries moved with shocking ease. Perhaps the most unsettling detail was not what the participants did. It was how quickly their previous identities became irrelevant. Outside the basement, these were students. Inside, those identities lost functional importance. The guard was no longer pretending to be powerful. He occupied a structure that made power feel natural. The prisoner was no longer pretending to be subordinate. He was embedded in conditions designed to reduce autonomy. This distinction matters. People often imagine morality as a stable internal possession, as though values exist untouched by context. The Stanford Prison Experiment challenged that assumption with brutal clarity. Under certain conditions, role expectations, architecture, symbols, hierarchy, surveillance, and permission structures can rapidly reshape conduct. The individual does not disappear. But the available behavioral range narrows dramatically. What feels possible changes. What feels acceptable changes. What feels justified changes. This is why environments are not passive backgrounds. They are behavioral ecosystems. A room communicates rules. A hierarchy communicates permission. A system communicates what parts of you are useful, rewarded, tolerated, or suppressed. The participants did not wake up one morning transformed into entirely different people. Something subtler occurred. The environment selected behaviors, reinforced them, and accelerated adaptation until those behaviors started feeling coherent with the role. This is how situational control works, not through force alone, but through repeated alignment between structure and action until resistance begins feeling psychologically expensive. This is why changing yourself while preserving the same architecture is often a losing negotiation. You may believe your identity is self-authored, but environments continuously propose versions of you. Some environments reward assertiveness. Others reward obedience. Some invite expansion. Others compress you into familiar shapes until deviation feels socially or psychologically dangerous. And the longer you remain inside a system, the more invisible its influence becomes. The prison in Stanford was artificial. But many systems outside laboratories are not. They are older, subtler, and infinitely more personal. A workplace can shape silence. A family can preserve dependency. A social circle can punish growth by rewarding predictability. A room can teach distraction. A schedule can train exhaustion. And all of it can happen gradually enough that adaptation feels like authenticity. You begin saying, "This is just how I am under pressure. This is just how I behave around these people. This is just my personality." But maybe those statements are less confessions of identity and more descriptions of environmental negotiation. Because if 6 days were enough to distort behavior inside a simulated prison, an uncomfortable question becomes impossible to avoid. What happens after months, after years, after entire phases of life spent inside systems quietly training you into a version that no longer feels chosen, but automatic? And more disturbingly, how much of what you call yourself was simply shaped by a context you stopped noticing long ago? The influence of an environment does not always arrive through architecture, uniforms, or explicit authority. Sometimes it arrives through something far more primitive. Other people. In 1951, psychologist Solomon Asch designed a deceptively simple experiment at Swarthmore College. There was no prison, no coercion, no threat, no elaborate manipulation of status or identity. Just a room, a group of participants, and a task so visually obvious it seemed almost impossible to fail. A participant was seated with several others and shown 2 cards. One card displayed a single vertical line. The other displayed 3 comparison lines labeled A, B, and C. The task was trivial. Identify which comparison line matched the length of the original. Anyone with functioning eyesight could answer correctly, and that was precisely the point. Unknown to the real participant, everyone else in the room was part of the experiment. Confederates. Their job was simple. On certain trials, they would intentionally give the same incorrect answer. One by one, they responded with confidence. Wrong. Wrong again. Wrong again. Then the real participant was asked to answer publicly. This is where the experiment stopped being about vision. It became an encounter with one of the most powerful forces shaping human behavior. The discomfort of standing alone against a group. The participant could see the correct answer. Reality was visually available. Truth was not ambiguous. And yet something invisible entered the room. Not confusion. Pressure. The pressure was subtle enough to remain socially invisible, yet strong enough to bend judgment itself. No threat was spoken. Nothing needed to be. The room had already communicated something more powerful. Agreement is safety. The results were unsettling. Across the trials, a substantial number of participants conformed to the group's clearly incorrect answers at least once. In Asch's original studies, approximately 75% of participants yielded to the majority on some trials. Not because they could not see. Not because the task was difficult. Not because they lacked intelligence. They conformed while knowing the answer was wrong. This distinction matters. The experiment did not merely reveal intellectual error. It revealed a collision between perception and belonging. Participants later described the experience in revealing ways. Some reported genuine doubt emerging the moment multiple people confidently agreed on the wrong answer. Others admitted they knew the group was wrong, but went along anyway to avoid standing out, appearing foolish, or disrupting social harmony. This is where conformity becomes psychologically dangerous. Reality may remain visible, but social cost begins distorting your relationship to it. You start asking different questions. Not, what is true, but, what happens if I say what I see? Will I become awkward? Will I create tension? Will I be judged? Will I become separate? That final question often matters most. Human beings are profoundly social organisms. Isolation historically carried survival consequences. To be excluded was not merely emotionally unpleasant. Across most of human history, it was materially dangerous, which means the nervous system still treats belonging as something far deeper than preference. It treats it as regulation, as safety, as continuity, and under the right pressure, people will often negotiate with reality before negotiating with the threat of social separation. This mechanism does not remain inside laboratories. It migrates everywhere. A person enters a social circle where cynicism is normalized. Gradually, ambition starts feeling embarrassing. A family system rewards emotional suppression. Vulnerability begins feeling inappropriate. A workplace punishes dissent. Silence becomes adaptive. No one announces the rules formally. That is what makes the process so efficient. The group does not need to force obedience when belonging itself becomes the leverage. A raised eyebrow, pause after you speak, a subtle shift in tone, laughter at the wrong moment, disapproval delivered through facial expression alone. These signals are often enough. Behavior begins adjusting automatically to reduce friction. The individual rarely experiences this as surrender. It feels more innocent, more practical, more socially intelligent. You tell yourself you are simply adapting, being flexible, reading the room, but repeated adaptation carries a hidden cost. Eventually, the line between social calibration and self-erasure begins to blur. You stop asking whether your reactions reflect your actual perceptions. You start optimizing for acceptance. And over time, a strange inversion occurs. The group no longer merely influences your behavior. It begins influencing what feels believable, what feels sayable, what feels emotionally survivable. The most dangerous systems are not always those that punish difference loudly. Often, they are the ones that make self-betrayal feel polite. This is how environments preserve identities without needing physical barriers. The force is psychological. A group can keep a person loyal to an outdated version of themselves simply by making deviation costly. Not catastrophic, just uncomfortable enough. You want to become more disciplined, but everyone around you bonds through distraction. You want emotional maturity, but your environment rewards impulsivity, gossip, and reaction. You want growth, but familiarity is socially protected like an unwritten law. And so the tension becomes internal. Not because you lack vision, but because truth and belonging begin pulling in opposite directions. This is what makes conformity so powerful. It does not ask you to abandon yourself dramatically. It requests smaller concessions. One silence, one laugh you did not mean, one opinion softened, one instinct suppressed, one moment of self-editing to remain legible inside the tribe. Then repetition takes over. Eventually, the performance becomes easier than honesty. And the frightening part is how invisible the transition can be. You may believe you are preserving connection. Meanwhile, you are slowly negotiating away evidence of who you might have become under different social conditions. But there is a deeper problem hidden underneath all of this. Because even after a person recognizes the system, sees the pressure, and identifies the pattern, something inside them may already have learned a more dangerous lesson. Stop trying. There is a moment more dangerous than failure. It is not the moment you lose. It is the moment you conclude that effort no longer matters. In 1967, psychologist Martin Seligman and his colleagues began a series of experiments that would later become some of the most influential and controversial studies in behavioral psychology. The original focus was on avoidance learning. Dogs were placed in harnesses where they were exposed to mild electric shocks. Some dogs could stop the shocks by pressing a panel with their noses. Their actions mattered. A clear relationship existed between behavior and consequence. But another group faced a different condition. These dogs received shocks they could not control. No action changed the outcome. No response terminated the discomfort. No behavior restored agency. The experience was structurally simple, but psychologically devastating. An organism repeatedly encountered aversive events while being denied meaningful influence over what happened next. This is where something important began breaking. Not physically, cognitively. The nervous system was absorbing a brutal lesson. Your actions are irrelevant. This lesson was not taught verbally. It was installed through repetition. Tempt, failure, tempt, failure again. No contingency. No control. Just exposure to a pattern where effort produced no reliable effect. At first, the dogs struggled. They moved, resisted, searched for solutions. But after repeated exposure, behavior changed. The agitation declined. Movement decreased. Resistance weakened. The organism was still alive, still functional, still physically capable. But something essential had started shutting down. Not energy. Expectation. The most disturbing phase came later. After the initial conditioning, the dogs were moved into a shuttle box apparatus divided by a low barrier. On one side, mild shocks could be delivered through the floor. The escape route was simple. Jump over the barrier. That was all. No puzzle. No locked door. No extraordinary demand. A small movement was enough to end the discomfort. Dogs that had previously learned control adapted quickly. When shocks began, they escaped. But the dogs exposed earlier to uncontrollable shocks behaved differently. Many did not even try. They whimpered. They lay down. They endured the discomfort passively despite being physically capable of escape. This is what made the findings so psychologically explosive. The barrier was low. Freedom was accessible. The exit existed. But behavior had changed more deeply than the immediate environment. The organism had learned a generalized expectation. Not merely, this situation is bad, but my behavior does not matter. This distinction is enormous. The body was no longer evaluating each situation independently. It was carrying a model of reality forward. Past helplessness was contaminating present opportunity. This is how psychological passivity becomes self-reinforcing. A person can be surrounded by new options and still behave as though nothing has changed. Not because the options are fake, because expectation has been damaged. The external barrier may be gone, but internally, another barrier has already been constructed. And that one is often harder to detect. This mechanism extends far beyond laboratories. A person repeatedly attempts to improve their circumstances and meets failure, rejection, instability, or punishment. They try to build discipline and relapse. They attempt healthier relationships and encounter the same emotional patterns. They pursue opportunity and repeatedly collide with invisible resistance. At first, effort remains alive. They adjust, experiment, persist, search for another route, but repetition carries weight. After enough cycles where action appears disconnected from meaningful improvement, something subtle begins changing. Not desire, not intelligence, expectation. The person may still consciously want change, but their nervous system starts conserving effort. Why initiate action if previous action changed nothing? Why risk energy if outcomes feel structurally predetermined? This is not laziness in the simplistic sense people often imagine. It is an adaptive response to perceived uncontrollability. The system is attempting efficiency. It is reducing investment in behaviors statistically associated with disappointment. From the outside, this can look like passivity, procrastination, low ambition, avoidance, or apathy. But underneath, the logic is often far more coherent. The organism is no longer resisting life directly. It is resisting the anticipated pain of ineffective effort. And this creates one of the cruelest loops in human behavior. The less you act, the less evidence you collect that action can still matter. Which means the model remains intact. This is why some of the most limiting environments do not trap people physically. They train conclusions. They teach invisible assumptions about what effort is worth. You can leave the original circumstance and still carry its logic with you. A different room, a different relationship, a different opportunity, a different phase of life. Externally, the conditions have changed. Internally, the prediction remains untouched. Nothing I do will matter. This is how the past colonizes the future. Not by blocking movement, by altering interpretation. Possibility becomes harder to perceive. Opportunity looks suspicious. Freedom feels abstract. The person is no longer evaluating the present on its own terms. They are filtering it through accumulated evidence of futility. And this is what makes learned helplessness so dangerous. It survives environmental change. The cage no longer needs walls. It only needs a mind that has stopped expecting escape to work. Many people spend years trying to repair outcomes while never questioning the deeper assumption governing their effort. Not whether they are capable, but whether they still believe action can meaningfully alter reality. Because once that expectation collapses, the most difficult prison to leave is no longer external. It is the one built from repeated evidence that trying might be pointless. Not every system teaches you through punishment. Some teach you through atmosphere. A cracked wall. Trash gathering in a corner. Graffiti left untouched. A broken light that no one repairs. Signals like these appear trivial in isolation. Almost decorative. Easy to dismiss. But in 1982, political scientist James Q. Wilson and criminologist George L. Kelling published an article in The Atlantic that introduced a now famous idea, the broken windows theory. The central claim was deceptively simple. Visible signs of disorder communicate information. A broken window left unrepaired suggests that no one is monitoring the space. No one is invested in maintaining standards, and small violations may carry little consequence. The signal spreads. Neglect becomes communication. This was not originally framed as a grand theory of identity. It was a theory of environmental messaging. A neighborhood is constantly teaching people what is tolerated. Not through lectures, through evidence. If public disorder accumulates unchecked, the environment begins broadcasting a psychological message stronger than any posted rule. Boundaries here are weak. Expectations are low. Deviation is survivable. This matters because human beings are exquisitely sensitive to social cues embedded in physical spaces. A well-maintained environment implies order, oversight, and behavioral expectations. A deteriorating one implies the opposite. The physical world begins scripting behavior before conscious reasoning intervenes. What is allowed becomes visible. What is visible becomes normal. And what becomes normal starts shaping action. This is how environments quietly communicate identity options. Not by forcing behavior directly, but by informing the nervous system what version of you seems most compatible with the surrounding world. The theory gained extraordinary influence during the 1990s in New York City. At the time, the city was emerging from decades associated with visible disorder, graffiti-covered subway cars, fare evasion, vandalism, and high crime rates. Under Mayor Rudy Giuliani and Police Commissioner William Bratton, broken windows policing became highly influential in public policy. The strategy emphasized targeting small signs of disorder. Graffiti was aggressively removed. Fare evasion in the subway system was targeted. Public spaces were monitored with new intensity. The reasoning was not merely cosmetic. The assumption was behavioral. Small disorder, if tolerated, creates permission structures. Tiny norm violations accumulate and begin redefining the social atmosphere. A turnstile jump is not only a lost fare. It is a public signal. A statement about what can happen here. Likewise, a clean train communicates something else. A maintained station communicates something else. An orderly street communicates something else. Each environment broadcasts expectations. This was the psychological premise beneath the policy. Not all scholars agree on the extent to which broken windows policing directly reduced crime, and the theory remains debated and criticized in criminology and sociology. But one underlying observation proved difficult to ignore. Environmental cues shape behavior far more than people comfortably admit. A space does not merely contain activity. It frames it. People entering an environment are not interacting with neutral scenery. They are entering a field of behavioral suggestions. And many of those suggestions are absorbed before a single conscious decision is made. This logic extends beyond cities. A bedroom is also a behavioral environment. A desk covered in unfinished tasks, wrappers, clutter, and open distractions is not simply messy. It is communicating. A kitchen stocked with highly convenient, impulsive options is communicating. A digital environment filled with constant alerts, fragmented attention, and algorithmic stimulation is communicating. The message is rarely verbal, but the nervous system receives it anyway. Standards are negotiable. Impulse is accessible. Friction is low. Order is optional. The physical and symbolic architecture around you becomes a feedback loop. You act in ways that align with the environment. Then your actions reinforce the identity suggested by the environment. Then that identity makes the environment feel increasingly natural. A loop closes. This is how external disorder gradually becomes internalized. Not through dramatic collapse, through normalization. A person begins tolerating conditions that once felt unacceptable. Then behaviors emerge that are coherent with those conditions. Eventually, the environment no longer feels like an influence. It feels like reality itself. This is the subtle violence of neglected systems. They do not simply surround you. They teach you what level of order, attention, self-respect, and intentionality seems normal enough to maintain. This is why people often underestimate the psychological cost of what they repeatedly tolerate. Every environment is making claims about what matters, about what gets maintained, about what deserves attention, about what version of you is easiest to become here. A neglected space quietly lowers expectations. Not because anyone announced lower standards, because the evidence is ambient. You stop reaching for precision because imprecision is everywhere. You stop expecting depth because distraction is the default texture of the environment. You stop protecting intention because nothing around you appears built to support it. And over time, this changes more than behavior. It changes what feels proportionate, what feels worth doing, what feels excessive, what feels unnecessary. A cleaner room can feel strangely demanding. A more intentional routine can feel artificial. A higher personal standard can feel almost performative. Not because these things are unnatural, because disorder has been normalized long enough to redefine baseline reality. This is how environments become identity scaffolding. They do not merely reflect who you are. They participate in stabilizing who you continue becoming. And the most dangerous part is not the visible mess. It is how quickly the mind can adapt to a degraded standard and begin calling it normal life. Human beings like to believe they stop when they decide to stop. When they are full, they stop eating. When they are tired, they stop working. When they have consumed enough, they naturally disengage. This story is psychologically comforting. It preserves the illusion that conscious intention remains firmly in control. But in 2005, researcher Brian Wansink and his colleagues designed an experiment that quietly challenged this assumption with absurd simplicity. Participants were invited into what appeared to be a normal lunch setting. They were served tomato soup. Nothing unusual was announced. No deception was visible. Some participants received ordinary soup bowls. Others were given specially modified bowls connected through hidden tubing to a reservoir beneath the table. As participants ate, these bowls were secretly refilled from below. The soup level barely changed. The bowl appeared almost endless. A visual stopping cue had been removed. This detail sounds trivial. It was not. In ordinary eating behavior, people often rely on external signals to regulate consumption. An empty plate, a finished package, a shrinking portion, a visible endpoint. These cues quietly inform behavior. They create a sense of completion, a natural interruption, a moment where action can be reconsidered. But when the environment removes that interruption, something revealing happens. Behavior continues, not because the person consciously chooses endless repetition, but because the architecture supporting stopping has been altered. The action no longer encounters friction, and without friction, default behavior often runs longer than intention ever planned. The absence of a boundary became its own instruction. Continue. The results were striking. Participants eating from the self-refilling bowls consumed significantly more soup than those using normal bowls. On average, they ate substantially larger quantities without proportionally increased awareness. Many did not report feeling significantly more full. Some did not notice anything unusual at all. This is what made the findings psychologically unsettling. Consumption was not being regulated purely by internal sensation. It was being regulated in part by environmental architecture. The body contains signals, but behavior does not always wait for them. People often use external boundaries as decision substitutes, not because they are irrational, because the nervous system constantly seeks efficiency. An empty container simplifies choice. A finished portion resolves ambiguity. A stopping cue closes a behavioral loop. Without one, the loop remains psychologically open. This is not limited to food. The mechanism is everywhere. An infinite scroll has no natural endpoint. A streaming platform automatically loads another episode. A workday without structural boundaries expands endlessly. A conversation thread keeps resurfacing. A phone screen refreshes with no completion signal. Modern environments are often engineered to minimize stopping cues, not by accident, but because uninterrupted behavior is predictable behavior. And predictable behavior is easy to sustain. What feels like weak self-control is often something less flattering to human pride. The person is not continuously making decisions. They are being carried by architecture designed to avoid decision points. Behavior is not always actively chosen. Sometimes it is simply left uninterrupted. This changes how habits should be understood. People often frame unwanted behaviors as failures of discipline. Why did I keep going? Why didn't I stop sooner? Why do I always overconsume, overwork, overthink, overscroll, overindulge? The questions assume a decision was consciously renewed each time. Often it was not. Many habits persist not because they are actively chosen moment by moment, but because the environment has removed natural exit points. The behavior keeps flowing through an open channel. An unfinished browser tab invites return. Food placed within arm's reach lowers interruption cost. Notifications collapse attention back into fragmented loops. Objects positioned visibly recruit action. Objects hidden create friction. Tiny environmental structures accumulate into behavioral probability. This is habit architecture, not dramatic force, subtle guidance. A world arranged to make certain actions frictionless and others effortful. The difference matters. Because if your surroundings continuously remove stopping cues from behaviors you want less of, while simultaneously increasing friction around behaviors you want more of, your intentions are placed in structural conflict. You are negotiating uphill, not against yourself alone, against architecture. And architecture is patient. It does not argue. It simply keeps making one path easier than another until repetition begins masquerading as personal preference. This is why so much behavior feels strangely automatic. Not because human beings are incapable of intention, but because intention is often outnumbered. A person may genuinely want to stop, but what does stopping require? Conscious interruption, a moment of awareness, a friction point strong enough to break continuity, a visible boundary reminding the mind that continuation is optional. Remove enough of these, and behavior begins resembling inertia. Motion continues because nothing meaningfully interrupts it. This is not dramatic loss of control. It is something quieter. A slow surrender of behavioral authorship to surrounding design. You reach for what is visible. Continue what remains open. Return to what was never fully closed. And over time, These repeated continuations become the architecture of daily life. This is how environments do not merely influence what you do. They influence when you stop doing it. And that distinction is often where identity gets quietly shaped. Because a person is not only the sum of what they begin, they are also the sum of what their environment makes difficult to end, which raises a more uncomfortable possibility. How much of what you call habit is not a deeply chosen pattern at all, but simply a sequence your environment never taught you how to interrupt? Sometimes transformation does not begin with inspiration. It begins with rupture, a violent interruption of continuity, a forced separation from the architecture that kept an old identity alive. Before he became Malcolm X, Malcolm Little was moving through a life structured by instability, crime, and fragmented belonging. His early years were marked by repeated trauma. His father, Earl Little, died under suspicious circumstances after years of racial intimidation. His mother, Louise Little, was later institutionalized. His family was fractured. By adolescence and early adulthood, Malcolm was immersed in street life. He moved through Boston and Harlem, engaging in hustling, burglary, gambling, and drug activity. The environment around him was not neutral. It offered scripts, roles, status systems, rewards, a recognizable identity ecology. Certain behaviors were reinforced. Certain associations stabilized a predictable future. Then in 1946, at age 20, Malcolm was sentenced to prison for burglary. The sentence was severe, 7 to 10 years. What appears externally as punishment became something more structurally significant. An environmental severance. The routines collapsed. The geography changed. The social network was interrupted. The pace of daily life was forcibly redesigned. Prison removed autonomy, but it also removed continuity. The old identity system lost access to its familiar reinforcements. The same streets were gone. The same stimuli disappeared. The same behavioral loops could no longer run with their previous ease. A person often imagines identity as internal essence. But much of identity is logistical. It survives through repeated contact with familiar inputs. Remove enough of those inputs and something destabilizes, not necessarily because the person has changed yet, but because the old self has temporarily lost its ecosystem. Inside prison, Malcolm encountered something rare: constraint paired with structure. Time became abundant. Distraction was reduced. Access narrowed. Routine intensified. This did not automatically produce growth, but it created conditions where a different identity could become more behaviorally possible. During incarceration, Malcolm began reading extensively. He later described copying entire pages of the dictionary by hand to improve vocabulary and literacy. Word by word, page after page, not as symbolic gesture, as repetitive cognitive reconstruction. His letters and later autobiography describe nights spent reading under dim corridor light after official lights out. Books became replacement stimuli. History, philosophy, religion, politics, language. The informational environment changed dramatically. Instead of the rapid reinforcement cycles of his former life, prison gradually exposed him to slower systems of thought. Reflection became possible partly because environmental noise had been reduced. Equally important, Malcolm came into contact with correspondence from family members connected to the Nation of Islam. These exchanges introduced a new ideological framework, a new narrative, a different interpretation of self, race, discipline, purpose, and destiny. Identity is rarely rebuilt through isolated insight. It is rebuilt through repeated exposure. New inputs, new language, new rituals, new systems of meaning rehearsed often enough to become psychologically inhabitable. The transformation was not magical. It was architectural. A new routine began stabilizing a different future. Not because desire alone changed, because the daily system supporting identity had been radically reorganized. By the time Malcolm left prison in 1952, he was not simply the same man with new ideas. His operating system had changed. His schedule had changed. His language had changed. His intellectual frame had changed. His social affiliations had changed. His symbolic identity had changed. Even his name would eventually change. This matters because radical identity shifts often require more than motivation layered onto an existing system. They require environmental discontinuity large enough to destabilize old reinforcement loops. Malcolm did not transform while casually negotiating with the exact conditions that had reinforced his earlier life. Those conditions were forcibly interrupted. The interruption created space. Space created exposure. Exposure created repetition. Repetition made an alternative self increasingly coherent. This is uncomfortable because it suggests something many people resist. The old self is often more dependent on context than it appears. Certain identities survive because they are continuously resupplied. The same conversations, the same neighborhoods, the same cues, the same emotional economies, the same scripts available on demand. Remove the system, and the identity begins losing automatic support. This does not guarantee improvement, but it increases plasticity, creates behavioral looseness, a temporary instability where something new can actually take root. Without rupture, many people are not failing to change because they lack desire. They are failing because the old structure remains fully operational. This is what makes transformation feel so rare. People often try to become someone new while preserving nearly every structural ingredient that maintains the previous version. Same environment, same access, same schedule, same relationships, same triggers, same recovery loops. Then they wonder why change feels unstable. But identity is not held together by belief alone. It is maintained through systems of repetition. This is why forced rupture can sometimes accelerate change more effectively than voluntary effort. Not because suffering is inherently transformative, but because interruption destabilizes continuity. It removes automaticity. It introduces a gap between stimulus and response where reconstruction becomes possible. Malcolm's prison years were not romantic. They were restrictive, harsh, and coercive. But inside that confinement, an old identity lost oxygen. A different one gained structure. And this reveals something psychologically unsettling. Sometimes the biggest obstacle to becoming someone new is not lack of ambition. It is uninterrupted access to who you have always been, which raises a more difficult question. If the old version of you is continuously fed by your current system, what exactly would need to disappear before a different self could finally survive? There are behaviors people treat as permanent, evidence of weak character, proof of irreversible damage, a private sentence carried for life. Addiction is often framed this way, as if once a behavior reaches sufficient intensity, it becomes fused to identity, a fixed internal defect, a permanent war inside the individual. During the Vietnam War, this assumption faced an uncomfortable challenge. By the early 1970s, heroin use among U.S. soldiers in Vietnam had become a major concern. Reports suggested alarmingly high rates of use. The public fear was immediate and dramatic. Thousands of young men were expected to return home carrying entrenched heroin addiction. A national crisis seemed inevitable. The dominant expectation was simple. Once addicted, always vulnerable. Once deeply conditioned, relapse would follow soldiers home. But researcher Lee Robbins conducted follow-up studies on returning veterans and documented something that contradicted prevailing assumptions. A large proportion of soldiers who had used heroin heavily in Vietnam stopped after returning to the United States. Not after years of intensive treatment. Not after heroic acts of self-overcoming. After environmental relocation. The finding was psychologically disruptive. The substance had not changed. The individuals had not magically become stronger overnight. What changed was context. The cues, routines, social networks, pressures, locations, and behavioral triggers associated with use had been dramatically disrupted. The ecology of addiction had been interrupted. This did not mean addiction was imaginary or trivial. It meant something more destabilizing. Behavior often depends more on environmental continuity than people are comfortable admitting. What looked like permanent compulsion was, in part, deeply entangled with place. Vietnam was not simply a geographic location. It was a behavioral ecosystem: extreme stress, uncertainty, isolation, trauma exposure, peer influence, availability, disrupted future orientation, daily proximity to death. These conditions matter. Behavior never occurs in a vacuum. It emerges inside systems. A drug is not encountered as a chemically isolated object. It is embedded in ritual, emotion, timing, geography, people, and state-dependent learning. Repeated enough times, the environment itself becomes part of the behavioral circuit. A room can become a cue. A sound can become a cue. A social group can become a cue. A time of day can become a cue. A particular emotional state can become a cue. This is why returning home mattered. Soldiers were not only leaving a war zone, they were leaving a network of associated triggers. The environmental scaffolding sustaining the behavior had been disrupted. The learned loops lost access to many of their original activation conditions. The person was still the same organism, but the probability landscape had changed. This distinction is crucial. A behavior may appear deeply internal, but its activation can depend heavily on surrounding architecture. Remove enough linked cues, and a pattern once perceived as inevitable can weaken dramatically. Not because desire disappears entirely, but because repetition has lost some of its structural support. This is one of the most unsettling implications of behavioral science. The stability of a habit may tell you less about who someone is than about the system repeatedly reactivating it. This reframes an enormous category of human suffering. People often interpret recurring behavior as proof of inner deficiency. Why do I always go back? Why do I repeat this pattern? Why can't I seem to break free? The question usually points inward, toward willpower, character, self-discipline, moral strength. But often the more accurate question is environmental. What system keeps reactivating this sequence? What cues remain intact? What loops remain available? What identity conditions remain continuously supplied? A person trying to change while preserving every cue associated with the old behavior is often attempting behavioral surgery without altering surrounding anatomy. The system remains loaded, triggers remain positioned, access remains convenient, states remain predictable. Then repeated activation gets mistaken for personal inevitability. This is not an argument for passivity. It is an argument for precision. If context helped construct the pattern, context must be taken seriously in its disruption. New behaviors rarely survive on intention alone. They require competing systems, new architecture, new cues, new repetitions, new probabilities. The self is not rebuilt only through rejection of the old. It is stabilized through repeated contact with a different operating environment. This is the uncomfortable conclusion many people resist. You may not be fighting a defective self. You may be fighting a perfectly predictable system. A system that repeatedly exposes you to the same triggers, same emotional states, same access points, same rhythms, same relational patterns, same behavioral invitations. Then quietly asks why you continue becoming the same person. Identity can feel deeply personal, but behavior is often ecological. A pattern reinforced by architecture, timing, availability, and repetition. This is why change can feel so mysteriously fragile. Not because transformation is impossible, but because the surrounding system keeps supplying the previous version with oxygen. The old self is not always stronger. It is often simply better resourced, more rehearsed, more cued, more structurally supported. This changes the nature of the problem. The question is no longer only what you want to stop, but what environment you are repeatedly returning to. Because the most dangerous systems are rarely the ones that visibly imprison you. They are the ones that make an old version of you feel continuously natural, continuously available, and almost impossible to escape. There is a fantasy people rarely admit to themselves, that one day they will wake up different. Same room, same habits waiting, same phone on the nightstand, same conversations, same invisible gravitational fields. But suddenly, through some internal miracle, they will behave like someone new. More disciplined, more focused, less reactive, less afraid. This fantasy is emotionally seductive because it preserves comfort. It allows the person to imagine transformation without sacrifice, reinvention without disruption, a new identity installed on top of an unchanged operating system. But systems do not negotiate with fantasy. A room is not neutral. An object is not neutral. A recurring conversation is not neutral. A repeated emotional pattern is not neutral. Everything around you is either reinforcing a behavioral probability or weakening one. Every day, your environment is voting, not symbolically, mechanically. It rewards certain actions with ease, punishes others with friction, makes some versions of you accessible in seconds and others expensive to reach. And because this process is gradual, most people never experience it as coercion. They experience it as personality. They say, "This is just how I am. This is what I like. This is what I always do," without realizing how often preference is simply repeated exposure that became familiar enough to feel like identity. Comfort is persuasive. Familiarity is persuasive. Repetition is persuasive. Enough repetition can make a prison feel autobiographical. It can make confinement feel like self-expression. And that may be the most dangerous illusion of all. Not that you are trapped, but that the cage has learned how to feel like home. This is why real change often feels offensive before it feels liberating. A new system does not initially feel natural. It feels inconvenient, artificial, rigid, uncomfortable, a disruption of familiar emotional rhythms. People often misinterpret this discomfort. They assume resistance means misalignment, that if change were truly right, it would feel intuitive, smooth, self-expressive. But the old self was also rehearsed. It was made efficient through repetition. Its pathways were paved. Its cues were familiar. Its emotional logic was overlearned. Of course, deviation feels awkward. Of course, interruption feels unnatural. Novelty creates friction precisely because it has not yet been metabolized into identity. This is where many people retreat, not because the new path is wrong, because unfamiliarity is psychologically expensive. The nervous system confuses prediction with safety. What is known feels manageable, even when it is destructive. This means growth often requires tolerating a temporary identity vacuum, a period where you no longer feel fully like your old self, but have not yet accumulated enough repetition to stabilize the new one. This space is psychologically brutal. You feel incoherent, uncertain, inauthentic, like an actor inside your own life. But this is often not failure. It is transition stripped of romance. A dismantling period where the previous system is losing dominance while the next one is still structurally weak. Most people quit here, not because transformation was impossible, because becoming someone else briefly feels like becoming no one at all. There is another cost rarely discussed. When you alter your system, you do not only disturb habits, you disturb relationships. Human groups are stabilized through predictability. Roles become distributed. Expectations harden. One person is impulsive. One is dependable. One is always available. One is always chaotic. These identities do not exist privately. They are socially reinforced. When you begin changing patterns, the surrounding system often notices before you do. Not consciously, structurally. Your unpredictability introduces instability. The role you used to play becomes less reliable, and systems dislike ambiguity. This is why change can provoke subtle resistance. A joke, a dismissal, a comment framed as concern, a reminder of who you used to be, not always malicious, often automatic. The social environment attempts recalibration. It tries to restore equilibrium, to pull you back into recognizability. This is not because people necessarily want your failure. Often they simply prefer continuity. Your change forces renegotiation, and renegotiation is metabolically expensive. This means transformation is not only an internal event. It is relational disruption, a redistribution of expectations, a reorganization of access, a disturbance to familiar dynamics. Sometimes the environment fights to preserve you not because it loves who you could become, but because it has already optimized itself around who you have been. At some point, every person faces the same quiet confrontation. Not with motivation, not with knowledge, with willingness. Willingness to become temporarily incompatible with the life currently reinforcing them. Willingness to tolerate unfamiliarity, to create friction where comfort once existed, to remove access, to redesign exposure, to disappoint old expectations, to interrupt loops that once felt automatic enough to be mistaken for destiny. This is less dramatic than people imagine. Often no grand declaration occurs. No cinematic reinvención. Only a sequence of structural decisions repeated long enough to make a different life statistically possible. A moved object, a deleted contact, a changed route, a new schedule protected with unusual seriousness. A refusal to remain endlessly available to what keeps reproducing the same self. Identity rarely shatters in one moment. It starves, slowly, through lack of reinforcement, and something else equally slow begins feeding. Eventually one system weakens, another stabilizes. A different version becomes less theoretical and more operational, less imagined and more embodied. Then one day the old environment no longer recognizes you with the same precision. Not because you found your true self, but because you finally understood something simpler. You do not become what you want. You become what your life repeatedly allows.